Talking in this series about the history of race relations in American Presbyterianism. We've gone through a story over the last 4 sessions that covers 3 centuries from the 1700s all the way up to our present time. Today we're going to engage in some reflection on that story, as well as consider, insofar as it's possible, its implications for our own present situation. And I want to begin with a couple of responses to comments that I've already received about the things we've been discussing, and I want to just briefly note those before going into the main substance of what I have to say this morning. I want to repeat here something that I said at the very first session, but it's important and I think worth repeating. And that is that this version of the story that I have been talking about through these 4 sessions is, as most of you know, part of a larger story that I have not discussed at all. And in the back of our minds, we need to have an awareness of that larger story and maybe sometime get into some of the details. And by that, I mean the following. I have not talked about the aspect of this topic that has to do with Native Americans. I have not talked about the aspect of this story that has to do with Asian Americans. I have not talked about the part of this story that has to do with Hispanic Americans. Those 3 in particular are on my mind because if you know anything about the details of American Presbyterian history, you will know that there have been segments of our church who have all been representative of those communities, and they all have a story to tell which is fraught with racism. And at some point, it's important, I think, to be not only to be aware of that, but perhaps to learn something about it, because it's just intertwined with the story that we're discussing here. I think the one that we're discussing here is of special importance. I would say a special importance in this part of the country. Having lived a small portion of my life in South Dakota, I would tell you there's a different version of the story that's important there. The relationship to Native Americans is almost as sort of interesting and problematic as the one that we've been discussing here is in the South. And the same thing in California. If you were in the far West, you would be focused much more on Asian Americans. We have now a couple of caucuses in our church, which are Korean Americans in particular, who are quite eloquent on victimization that they have suffered. So there's a much larger story of which this black-white story is a part. I acknowledge that, and all I'm saying here is I have not done anything about that because this story, I think, is of special importance for us, particularly in this part of the country. A question was also raised in the commentary online about what I did in the last 4 sessions, and the question, to put it bluntly, is why have a white guy do this? And I think that's a quite appropriate question, and I'm going to give you an answer to it. You will see in the course of my remarks this morning that I am very interested in us hearing more Black voices in this conversation. I think that's really essential, so I agree with that. And I think it's therefore quite appropriate in the future as we pursue this topic for us to take steps to hear directly Black voices on this topic. On the other hand, and this is why I chose this topic for my contribution to adult education this year as a member of Lewinsville, because I think we, as most all of us are white people, I think we have our own work to do on this topic. And I've been told in particular by African Americans with whom I've discussed this problem that we can do so much, but you have your own work to do, particularly in learning about your history, but also then rethinking that history. And I want you to understand this set of talks as an attempt to accomplish those 2 things, not only to learn the history, but also to rethink the history. And I'll just say finally on that point, in my own reading of Presbyterian history, American Presbyterian history, my mind has been changed about a lot of things by virtue of my exposure to this particular story of Black Presbyterians. I think of the history of American Presbyterianism differently because of my exposure to this this particular part of the story, which is so important. And frankly, you can read histories of American Presbyterianism just like you can read histories of American Methodism, Anglicanism in this country, and the race problem is almost not existed, not mentioned, or if it's mentioned in passing. If I were to write in a serious way on the history of American Presbyterianism, I would give this a lot of importance for what I hope by now are obvious reasons. The final thing I want to say by way of preliminaries is this. I have given what I would characterize as a big picture version of the story in these talks. And I've done that for the following reason. I think it's very important to respond to the claim, which I believe just is obviously true, that racism in American life has deep roots, which go far, far back. And I subscribe to, I said at the very beginning of my talks, and I'll say it again, to William Faulkner's famous claim, the thing about the past is that it's never really passed. It's passed down, down, down from one generation to the next. And so it's woven into our identity and our thinking, even before we start thinking about these problems. So it's important to, if you will, excavate the past on this topic in particular. And that's why I think a big picture approach to this, going back centuries, is desirable. And I think that helps us to understand better not only what has gone on in the past and how it's contributed to the present, but also what is and is not distinctive about our own time. I'm going to make 3 points this morning in a predictably long-winded way. The first of these points is to identify a problem. To identify a problem which I think grows out of the history that I've tried to sketch, and is just all too dramatically evident for the longest time in American Presbyterian history, and I'm including in this all of the different parts of the country, not just the South. I'm going to identify a problem. I'm going to talk, secondly, about the current sort of version of the problem and what we might be able to do about it. I'm mindful here of people on this call, and I value them deeply for this stance, saying to me and others all the time, well, what's the practical implication? What's the practical implication? What can we do about it? Well, I'm going to try in this particular second part of my remarks to answer that question. And then thirdly, I want to talk about the current situation just a bit, and I want to focus on Black Lives Matter. I think the response to Black Lives Matter as a movement, but more broadly as a phenomenon, is a very important part of thinking through what each one of us as Christians might do in response to the current situation, and also what we might do collectively as a congregation and more broadly as a denomination. What is the problem that I want to identify? Simply put, it's this. And I must say, the longer I've studied this problem, the more impressed I am and troubled I am by this thing I'm about to mention. The problem is this: whites ignoring the views of blacks, or if not ignoring them, refusing to accommodate them, or at least refusing to take them seriously in the church, in its own life, but also in the wider society. One of the reasons I've stressed so much the fact that we've had Black Presbyterians for a long, 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 long time is that right within, you might say, our own communion, as the term is sometimes used, right within our own communion are these Black voices. And I've just named a few people. By the way, I think one of the things that is very useful in studying this topic is to get a few names in mind and go back and look at the Francis Grimke's and the Gay Wilmores, who of course is much more our contemporary, many of us, and find out what they said and what they thought. And I think that helps to give you a sense of what was going on at the time, but also there's a kind of continuity running through these people over and over and over again. For centuries, they kept saying, this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong. And they said it both theologically, but also they appealed, as Martin Luther King did, by the way, to America's civic ideals. And they also said, and there was a kind of edge to their communications. They said, not only this is wrong, but it needs to stop now. Many of the early Presbyterian leaders were abolitionists. And of course, abolitionists tended to be the radicals of their time, radicals on the issue of race. So, and then later, of course, as they got into in the segregation era, they were very active in the creation of the NAACP. Grimke played a very important role in the creation of the NAACP. Now, as this goes along, the white Presbyterians, they're aware of this. Certainly some of them are, at least. The people who are in leadership positions in particular could not have been unaware of this. And yet they do one of two things. Either they ignore it. That's the thing that just amazes me. They ignore it. They talk as though it doesn't exist. And I think that's kind of symptomatic of something deep. We all know, we've all had experiences of being in the room and people kind of ignore us. They act like we're not there, like we're part of the furniture. That kind of thing is, I think, a part of what this, but then when they do have to deal with it, and here I've told you the story about Woodrow Wilson, but it just sticks in my mind. It's hard to get it out of your mind. Grimke appeals eloquently to Woodrow Wilson, please don't do this, please don't do this, please don't resegregate the civil service. And Wilson talks down to him. Good Lord. He talks down to this eloquent, highly educated, theologically sophisticated man and politically active man, Grimke, and basically says, I know best. I know best. It's better for the races to be segregated. And then he goes on to talk about, believe it or not, efficiency in the civil service, that is kind of compromised by having a desegregated workforce. So you have this long history, and by the way, all the way through the segregation era, this kind of dismissal of the problems with segregation as though they were unimportant. Eventually, and this is sort of the larger theme of my narrative, eventually this begins to change. And I'm some of you know I'm a basketball fan, and kind of I joked to Scott the other day that some people say that my real religion is a certain university's basketball team, and they also say that a friend of mine said, well, for you the high holy days are March, and it's got nothing to do with Lent. So let me borrow a term from CBS. Now here I'm mixing my metaphors here. There is one shining moment in my story. It's not the only shining moment, but it is a shining moment. And it comes in the 1960s. And I told you last time why I think that's the case. Here was a time when, and I'm not in awe of, but I'm deeply respectful of the mainline white Protestant leaders in that period who I think courageously stood up and said, in response to the appeal from King and others, this is the right thing to do. We've got to support this desegregation project in a very dedicated, serious way. And of course, as that happens, I hope you sense this is kind of a seismic shift, not just in church life, but more broadly in public life. The 1960s are the time when Black leaders begin to be taken seriously in public life. Let me say that again. The 1960s are the time when Black leaders, King of course is the great one, but there are others, begin to be taken seriously, and they begin to set the terms on which public debate about this matter takes place. Now, I in my own study of this, I just think that's a hugely important development, and it's changed fundamentally American public life with regard to the race issue. If I can borrow another metaphor, no longer on that topic, on race at least, will the Blacks be silenced? Will they be ignored? They will be taken seriously, or to use another metaphor, they will not be sent to the back of the bus. They're going to be right up in the front. They're going to be talking in a way that requires attention. Now, the other thing I want to say is, and there's so much these days, particularly from one side politically, but more broadly in our country, so much dissing of the mainline Protestant churches, the mainly white Protestant churches, because of their decline in numbers, their decline in influence. I had a friend at Georgetown, an acquaintance, let me rephrase that, an acquaintance at Georgetown who was very interested in this, who was very critical of the mainline churches, and he all but said, we are dead, which of course is nonsense. But there's no doubt that a fundamental shift in our society has taken place with regard to the status, the size of the mainline Protestant churches. But one of the things I want us to hold up for our affirmation this morning is the following. Even through that long period, which is brought about all kinds of soul searching in our denomination and others, clergy in particular have to worry about this sometimes directly, about the very existence of their congregations. Through that whole period, from the 1960s to the present, on the whole, the mainline Protestant denominations have held fast in their commitment to the cause of desegregation. Let me say that again. They have held fast in their commitment to the cause of desegregation, both internally and in relation to the wider society. In one denomination after another, there is this very strong emphasis on ending racism, on doing away with racism. It's kind of a mantra in these denominations. And related to that, very important thing, in all these denominations, our own included, you've seen the gradual rise to positions of prominence and leadership of Blacks. Blacks as your general presbyter, Blacks as your bishop, Blacks as your chief executive at the national level, and of course, Blacks as presidents and important figures in theological seminaries, where so much of the life of the church in the future is being shaped. And that in turn has meant that churches have been influenced, I think in some cases profoundly, by what I characterized in an earlier talk as liberation theology. It doesn't sometimes get packaged that way or labeled that way, but clearly these ideas, which we hear a lot about at Lewinsville, and we've heard about it from Scott, but from earlier pastors as well, sort of seep into the consciousness of the church. The church begins thinking about the Bible in a particular way. What are the parts of the Bible that should be accentuated and emphasized in thinking about the faith? The upshot of this, I would say, is the following. Even though demographically, it's a very important distinction, even though demographically we're not desegregated at all, we're still overwhelmingly white denominations, attracting very few people of color. That's the fact about mainline American Protestantism. The ethos of these churches with regard to race has changed fundamentally. The ethos, the prevailing ethos, has changed fundamentally. And that's very important. I don't think that's inconsequential at all. But, here comes the but in my presentation. It has been quite limited in its effects for the following reason. Continuing separation, I don't want to say segregation, but continuing separation of races at the congregational level. Let me repeat that. Continuing separation of the races at the congregational level. 98% of Presbyterians in this country worship in a church with a tiny fraction of people who are not Caucasians. Let me say that again. 98% of Presbyterians worship in congregations where the vast majority of people are white. Tiny little fraction, in some cases, none at all. We all know in parts of the country, there would be no people of color of any kind in the congregation. Now, let me add here and more sort of deepen what I said last time about Lewinsville and the different kinds of congregations and congregational responses to the upheaval of the 60s. The churches that have some significant percentage of the membership who are people of color tend to be in the inner city, in the interior, not necessarily the inner city, but in the interior of cities. This is in part a geographic problem. But the vast majority of Presbyterian congregations are not there. The vast majority of Presbyterian congregations are not in the interior of Los Angeles or the interior of Washington, D.C., or the interior of New York City. They're in the suburbs and the exurbs. And one of the most important things that happened, by the way, in the post-World War II period was an explosion of growth in all of the mainline Protestant churches in the suburbs. They became increasingly suburbanized denominations. churches that are suburban, churches that are rural, churches that are in small towns, all of those churches tend to be just physically separated, in many cases, not all, but physically separated from the Black population. So it creates a whole different dynamic. I remember when Betty and I came to Washington in the 1970s, we were interested in joining a church which had some significant racial mix. And I did the hubristic thing of going to the Presbyterian and asking them directly, well, what churches are there? And they named a few for us, and they're all in the interior of Washington, in the District of Columbia, all of them, just a few. Now that was in the 1970s. It hasn't changed. So you've got this situation in which the vast majority of Presbyterian congregations are in places that are separate from especially the historically Black congregations, both of our mainline denominations and also the historically Black churches. Now, having said all that, I want to confess something to you, and this could be a subject for interesting conversations. Let me just confess it and sow it as a food for thought in your own reflection on this. My study of this problem has led me to a profound ambivalence about racial separation in congregations. For the following reason, I have come to appreciate profoundly the importance of the Black church for the Black community. Let me say that again. The Black church for the Black community. And therefore, it would be kind of disturbing to me if somebody told me, well, over the next 10 or 20 or 30 years, the Black churches are going to fade away and we're going to have unsegregated churches, especially if that meant Blacks in particular being absorbed into predominantly white congregations. Keep in mind the terribly significant contributions which the separate Black congregations have made to our own church's life, the separate Black denominations have made to the nation's life. And I want to summarize all that by saying, I could use many words could be used to describe it, but I just think it's a truism. It's so obvious that the existence of separate Black churches, clearly a testament to the segregation of our society, clearly a testament in its own way to racism, have also been empowering. Let me say that again. The existence of separate Black congregations and separate Black denominations have also been empowering. And if you read what Black church people say, they will more often than not say something like that. It has been empowering. And note, when the door was opened to a more desegregated church in the Presbyterian world in the late 1960s, one of the first things that happened was the creation of the National Black Presbyterian Caucus, which was what? A sort of separating again at the denominational level of Black leaders in order that they could be, if you will, separate for certain purposes by themselves. And that exists to this day. Indeed, one of the most important parts of the equation now for Presbyterians in thinking about the future of the denomination is this caucus, National Black Caucus, Presbyterian Caucus, which is made up of some of the strongest leaders in the denomination who are Black. Now, having said that, I hope you see that for me, this is a complicated problem. We live in segregated or separated churches. The vast majority of whites have no exposure to Blacks directly, at least in church. By the way, I'm going to say parenthetically, the place where I met Blacks in my experience in Washington was mainly at Georgetown. I rubbed shoulders with Blacks a lot at Georgetown and found my role in contributing to certain causes which had to do with the desegregation of the university. It was mainly there, and certainly not at Lewinsville, where there was hardly any opportunity for me to interact with African Americans. And I'm just holding myself up as an example of what I think is the common experience of white people in the Presbyterian world. It would be even more that way if I had gone to Indianapolis or some other places in the country you can well imagine. Now, having said all that, I want to say the following. I think there are steps that we can take to break through what I want to characterize as the racial separation, which now exists in American Presbyterianism, the racial separation. There's an enormous amount of racial separation. We have very little contact with blacks, but the more important thing is this. Because we have so little contact, we don't really know how they think or what they feel. We can speculate, but we don't really know. And I would argue that one of the most important contributions that this congregation can make to sort of addressing the larger societal challenge on this is to try to take steps to not eliminate that problem, but to counter it. And what might some of those steps be? Well, the first thing I would suggest is the following. And by the way, if we were to do this, and Scott is already leading us in this direction, if we were to do this, we would be following the lead of many other congregations which have already taken steps in this direction. And that is to work out some serious, active, ongoing collaboration with at least one other predominantly Black congregation. Let me say that again. Serious, active, ongoing collaboration with at least one other Black congregation. It could be Presbyterian. From my point of view, it'd be preferable if it were Presbyterian for certain reasons, but it could be, as Scott has proposed, it could be the Baptist church, which is closer to us. Now, what do I mean by serious collaboration? I mean the kind of collaboration that enables us to really get to know one another. And get to know one another maybe in a way that's even beyond what we get to know one another currently at Lewinsville. So that we're in a position to ask, we don't ask this formally, but we get to know, why is it that that person who looks so much like me in terms of career and education and so forth, why is it that that person really does believe in Black Lives Matter? I'll get to that in a moment. There's an enormous chasm in American society between the way white people generally think about these matters and Black people think about these problems. Well, what better way to get over the kind of siloization, the separation of consciousness that exists on this topic than by meeting one another and connecting one another in various contexts in congregational life. A second thing we can do, even if we don't connect in that way, a second thing we can do is simply to take steps through lectures, through reading that we do, to begin to understand what is the current voice of Black leadership. I, in my retirement, have made some effort to sort of educate myself on this. I really didn't know much about it before. And one of the things that I found most fascinating, just to give you an illustration, I've been reading books, articles and so forth, which have helped me to come to understand the way in which generally Black Protestants think about the Bible differently from white Protestants. There's a famous book now, it's only been out a few years, by a biblical scholar at Wheaton College called Reading While Black. Reading While Black. It's about reading the Bible, reading while Black. And you get into it and you think, well, I didn't think of it that way before. Why would I? And of course, then you begin to realize what is true of all of us. We read the Bible with a certain lens. And I read the Bible with a certain white lens based upon my experience and so forth. If you read the Bible through the Black lens, you begin to have a whole different understanding, not totally different, but significantly different understanding of rather basic and important theological ideas. And by the way, another thing, Black theology is not just liberation theology, but a big part of it is today liberation theology. And if we're going to really encounter the Black world, the world of Black Protestantism today, we've got to educate ourselves a bit on what that means. And of course, there are resources readily available for us to begin understanding the logic of liberation theology and why it appeals so much to the Black community. Final thing we could do is the following: a third big step. There is a conversation going on now, and I want to compliment people of whom I was very critical last week. Conservative Protestants in this country, people who oftentimes characterize themselves as evangelicals, have a very complicated history on race. And to my mind, they're really it's finally good that they're getting around to confessing a lot of involvement in things which were pretty bad in the 50s and 60s. The PCA and other conservative Protestant denominations have done that sort of thing in recent years. That's a good thing. And they have done something which I think we need to do more of, and that is to think very seriously about what can we do in the shaping of congregational life, which will encourage the participation of people of color, which will encourage, or to put it in other language, what can we do in the shaping of congregational life that will encourage our congregations to become, not in my lifetime, but probably in the lifetime of my children, I would hope, more genuinely multiracial. And there are things you can do. There are things you can do. And the most obvious thing you can do is reflect your aspiration in the structure of your staff. Now, having said that, I'll just immediately underscore a big problem. In the Presbyterian world today, less than 3% of the clergy are Black. So wouldn't it be wonderful I would say, if Lewinsville had let's say, just hypothetically, an associate pastor who was Black? Well, the problem there is that Black clergy person may be badly needed in a Black congregation. So there is a big problem there, but it is nonetheless indicative of the sort of thinking that needs to go on. What could we do in the shaping of our congregational life that would make it a more welcoming environment for people who are not white? And by the way, the goal here, I would say, I've given you a number already, but I'll give you that number again, is about 20%. Wouldn't it be great if Lewinsville had at least 20% of its members who were people of some race other than Caucasian? Final couple of comments. I'm already violating my promise to you, but let me quickly summarize the last thing I have to talk about, which is Black Lives Matter. Many people say that we're living through another one of those very important moments of, I like this phrase, racial reckoning in our society that happen ever so often. The last big one was the 50s and 60s, a moment of racial reckoning when one way to put this is to say that the white population sort of wakes up to a problem that's been there all along and is sensitive in a way that it hasn't previously been to the need for change. In our time, that has come. It appears, although I'm very cautious in my predictions here, it appears to have come about because of, well, we know the history here. And by the way, this goes back to well into the previous decade. Black Lives Matter emerged in the early 2000 teens. Didn't happen just overnight. Black Lives Matter has become the symbol, both as a phrase, but also as a movement of this moment of change. And so it's really entirely appropriate to look at Black Lives Matter and compare it with what happened in the 1960s and ask the question, is this the same? Is this different? And of course, the answer is both and. But let me stress here the difference. Black Lives Matter is very significantly different as a leadership force on this topic, race relations, more specifically civil rights, than the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. It's more secular. It has no clergy leadership. It is, I will say, even though there were all kinds of women that were active and playing a very important role, and not just a supportive role in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, the out front leadership was overwhelmingly male in the 60s. Not now at all. Much of the leadership of Black Lives Matter are female. And the most important thing for our purpose, Black Lives Matter, I don't know how much you know about it, but that as a movement has tended to distance itself rather overtly, rather consciously from the church. And I'm talking about, in particular, the Black church. This gets at an issue which Rob Hunter has raised in previous meetings of this class. Is this not reflective of sort of the mood which is symbolized by the emergence of this phenomenon of the nuns, that is, the people who tend to be younger, who are not religiously affiliated? And the answer, of course, is yes, absolutely, especially when you look at the leadership of Black Lives Matter. Now, this poses a big question, a big issue, a big challenge for the emergence of this movement and that kind of leadership. And there are other things, by the way. It's a very decentralized movement. resisting the kind of patriarchal, strongly hierarchical leadership which was characteristic of the civil rights movement. And above all, its secular character, overtly secular character. This has posed a big question for religious folk. And the question is this: support it or not? Support it or not? Now, interestingly enough, the Black leadership in our denomination has said, and I'm talking here about the Black caucus in particular, absolutely, we're foursquare in support of this movement. But it has proved to be not nearly so much a positive, gotten not nearly so positive response from whites in our church and more broadly in the Christian world, especially among white conservatives. White conservative churches, white Protestant conservatives, have been either very ambivalent about this or overtly hostile to it. And I just want to point to a couple of the issues they raise, which would go just show you how this very quickly gets to fundamentals. There actually is a serious pushback against Black Lives Matter in the white evangelical world on the grounds that social justice is not a biblical concern. Social justice is not this is social gospel. This is not a biblical concern. Or questions: does systemic racism really exist? Does it exist at all? In the evangelical world, you will find very, very intense debate about that question. I have to say, one very important leader of the PCA, Tim Keller, pastor of a mega church in New York City, a very prominent evangelical, has said yes, it does, and has gotten into all kinds of hot water because of his view on that topic. And another very important issue, which is interesting in this, is there has been a very strong history of white evangelicals being very supportive of the law enforcement community and being reluctant to engage in any kind of serious criticism of law enforcement forces. Now, I want to stress, not all Blacks are supportive of Black Lives Matter, but it is the case that there is a very deep sort of fissure in the Christian world in thinking about Black Lives Matter. Now, I want to conclude my remarks on this with the following observation. The avoidance of religious appeals in Black Lives Matter, and it is a rather deliberate thing, the avoidance of religious appeals raises a very, very interesting question. And the question is this. It's a fundamental question, such a fundamental question that it could easily be the topic of a long conversation. But fortunately for you, I'm about to shut up. But here's the question: can significant progress against racism be made in American society without overtly religious appeals? Let me say that again. Can significant progress in attacking racism in American society be made without overtly religious appeals? Now, to the secularists in our society, and there are many of them, I think the answer to that would be, of course there is. It's just obvious. You know, you appeal to humanist ideals, and there can't be any question about that. I would submit that it's not so simple. And I would submit that for the following reason. And here I want to just briefly make a bibliographical reference. In the bibliography that I made available to you, there is a reference to a wonderful book which I commend to you on this topic. David Chappell, who is a historian, this book came out in 2009, has a book in there called The Stone of Hope. That's from a quotation from a famous statement by Martin Luther King. It's a history of the role of religion in the civil rights struggle of the 50s and 60s. And his claim there is the following. He goes through a long history that in that period, at least, there had been all kinds of efforts made to move the country forward on non-religious grounds, and on the whole, they had not succeeded. So much so that there was deep pessimism among, shall we say, non-religious forces about this whole problem. You know, in the various ACLU and other quarters, and he said, what his conclusion was that the big contribution, which King in particular, but more broadly the forces around King made, was to provide a mechanism of change which was far superior to the secular ones in using religious symbols to appeal to the conscience of the white community. Last thing I want to say about this is the following. It's a very important thing to note. Black Americans are the most religious segment of the entire population. It's very clear. There's a lot of data on this. 75% of them, 75% of the Black community are actively affiliated with some church. That's much higher than the white population. And not only that, when asked, does religion matter? You know, there's the standard Pew questions on this. Does religion matter in your life? If so, does it matter a lot? Does it matter a little? Overwhelmingly, the Black population has by far the highest score on that kind of question. Does religion, does it matter to you? Is it significant in your life? By overwhelming majorities, the Blacks say, yes, 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 indeed, it matters a lot. It matters a great deal. And of course, the other thing about this is still, it is the case that overwhelmingly, the Black population in this country, if they are Christians, and the vast majority are Christians, if they are Christians, they are associated with the historically Black churches. Now, I want to concede that there is in the Black community, as with the rest of the population, some movement among younger people in particular, reflected in Black Lives Matter, in the direction of non-affiliation with churches. But that still, I want to stress, that still is a very small minority compared to the overwhelming majority that are on the other side of that issue. Let me stop there. Kathy, if you can unmute the rest of the House, and I'll listen to your thoughts and responses.
I think people have to do that individually. And I don't think you need permission to do it. So we do have two screens. So, you know, I think waving to get attention is a good thing. We do have a couple of questions in the chat. I think we had Rob following up. Well, thank you for Scott, who had to leave to go do Messy Church. And then Rob pointing out, why wasn't there a similar movement in the 1990s to BLM when we had Rodney King and O.J. Simpson and that sort of thing? And Pat suggested no social media. So that's what we have in the chat.
Well, I can answer Rob's question easily. I don't know.
So I think now people would raise their hands and sort of wave at us to get attention.
I see John Cluett. I see Jack Calhoun.
Well, if I may real quick, I'm not sure how exactly you're identifying Black Lives Matter. I mean, it seems like it can mean several things. And the thing that has astounded me is that the most basic meaning, I think, is just simply the literal assertion that, like other lives, you need to realize that Black lives actually matter. And I've been astounded at the pushback against that notion by people that are trying to say all lives matter. Well, of course that's true, but nobody questions that white lives matter. What has been in doubt for centuries is that Black lives matter. And this is just the basic assertion. It's like in the civil rights era, Black men standing with signs saying, "I am a man," you know, the same kind of assertion. And I'm surprised at how controversial that statement has been. It sounds like you're defining BLM in a broader context of movement against police violence, maybe, which is certainly tied up with it. But just the basic assertion seems to me pretty uncontroversial.
I'll just make a quick comment. I agree totally. I made a distinction at the beginning, and I probably made it too quickly. Black lives as a symbol, it seems to me, is one thing, and just as a basic idea, and that can easily be dissociated from Black Lives Matter as a movement with to some extent an agenda, and it was more the latter that I was referring.
See, I'm seeing Virginia is unmuted. I don't know whether that's because she wanted to weigh in, as is Rob Hunter at the moment.
Yeah, I'll just weigh in quick with a comment. I particularly liked your distinction between separate and segregated in the discussion, because it seemed to me for a long time that one of the obstacles is not a good word, but one of the factors in there not being more non-white membership in churches like ours is simply cultural. And I mean that even in a literal sense. I don't imagine that 18th and 19th century organ music is a major part of Black culture in America, but it is a major part of white church culture in the mainstream Protestant church, for example. I mean, there's just a whole ton of differences like that that aren't particularly meaningful when you get right down to it, are not particularly meaningful theologically, but culturally and organizationally, there's just wildly different traditions in the Black American tradition and in the European immigrant traditions in this country. I mean, at least until fairly recently, I'd be willing to bet that most Lutherans in this country had Scandinavian or German in their background. Most Presbyterians had British Isles or possibly Low Countries in their background, that kind of thing. And I think that's been a factor. It's just not, think about when you move to a new city, you look for a church in which you feel comfortable. I bet most people on this call would not feel comfortable in a church that featured, for example, witness calls or people moving vigorously during the hymns and that kind of thing. I think there's a cultural aspect there that we kind of lose sight of sometimes. That's why I think partnerships with majority Black churches and other kinds of things like that may be a more productive, fruitful way to go forward with this than trying to artificially construct. I mean, I agree, 20% would be great, but I'm not sure how we go about it, given those factors. Those are not religious factors. I would hope for the majority of people in our church, at least, there's not a political or social thing, you know, objection, if you will, to having a more diverse church. It's a little bit deeper than that. And the deepness of that cultural thing, I think, has a lot to do with some of the truly ugly things we see happening in the United States too. Separate issue.
Jack?
Perhaps a related point, Rob. I think we're on the same track here. I'm reading a book by Curry, who's the presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church, and he's Black. Really a marvelous book on love, incredible. And he was pastor of the largest Black church, Episcopal church in Baltimore, and his congregants were all the Black leading class. They were lawyers, doctors, ministers. And when they tried to reach out, that Curry tried to reach out to the Blacks around them, who were largely poor, single family, just all the indices of difficulty, hunger, joblessness, there was a tremendous pushback. So the question to you is, how much, Bruce, in your thinking, does the issue of class come into this? Because even a Black pastor passionately reaching out to Blacks had a very, very difficult time. And he lost members at first when, to be crude, the unwashed started to come in and the church got noisier. So I don't know how much the construct of class fits this, your analysis, Bruce.
I'll just say quickly that both what Rob said and what you said are very important parts of this challenge. And I agree totally. I think class is a big part of the issue. But I will say there are churches, and if we're interested in this, there are churches that have worked very seriously on both of these issues.
Mhm.
It's one thing to say generally we're open to it. It's another thing to say, all right, what kind of strategy can we develop to address this problem?
Yeah.
And when you do that, certain things begin to occur to people. I'll just leave it at that. I saw Vivian's hand over there. Vivian, did you want to comment?
And Sarah's got her hand up too.
Okay, I'm unmuted. I had a few comments, and this is more perhaps in terms of facilitation than actually bringing in membership of other races. My husband belonged to Our Savior Lutheran Church, which is in Arlington when we lived in Northern Virginia. They supported and sponsored an Eritrean church of immigrants. So this was a parallel church. They used the gymnasium basically to do their church services on Sunday, while the white congregation, mostly white congregation, worshiped in the sanctuary. But they often had church dinners together as a combined group. And that was a wonderful way to bring the two groups together. Now that's not American Black. And it did work beautifully because they shared so much. And on big events like Christmas and Easter, they would worship together. So that's just a suggestion.
Thank you. Sarah?
I was just going to pick up on the comment about culture. I think class definitely is something to consider, and that goes back to the neighborhood church. But I think I used to feel exactly the same way, that cultural differences would be a problem. But I don't feel that way anymore, because we're assuming that color is a certain culture, and that's not true. Just this week, I had an incredible discussion in a group where a member is considered African American, but she abhors the word Black. She says, I'm not Black, I'm brown. People assume so many things about her because of her skin. She said, I went to private school. I like classical music. You know, all these things that if we think that color equals a specific gospel rebel rousing worship, that's limiting too. We're making wrong assumptions.
Fair point.
Clay?
Yeah, I was going to say, I may not be on your screen. I want to go back to your question, Bruce, about whether we think, and I'm not going to articulate the way you phrased the question exactly right, so forgive me, but basically whether mainline Protestant or whether this movement requires the church to be a component of it. And I haven't thought this all the way through, but I would say that my initial thinking is that the answer to that is yes. And the reason is that if some of the biggest problem of seeing the world as John Cluett described, which is, well, of course, Black Lives Matter, is coming from areas of the country that are almost entirely homogeneous and white, who don't have experience with people who are different from them, then it becomes easy to sort of hide behind, well, my church is all white, so you know that sort of construct for society must have some sort of okayness associated with it. Until I think mainline denominations can articulate in a way that's compelling to their congregations, every human being is a child of God, and white people are no more children of God than black people are children of God, then Christianity or predominantly white churches can be sort of refuges for not seeing equality as an okay thing. Anyway, I welcome other thoughts on the whether churches being a component of this is essential or not.
Good.
Yeah, I think it's important to note that probably part of the resistance to churches being involved from some of the leaders of BLM has to do with being wounded in those churches. Remember that the three major leaders of that movement are not only women, but they all identify as something other than straight, somewhere on the GLBTQ spectrum. And so that is part of the picture and can't be ignored.
Just to follow up to Clay's thing, I'm not sure whether the churches being part of this movement are essential for the movement, but I would think that it's essential for the churches. That if we're not part of this movement, we're just continuing to make ourselves irrelevant to what we should be doing.
I would also distinguish between the churches as institutions and the use of religious symbols, religious ideas in public life. One of the things that's really striking about Martin Luther King to me is that he has a kind of genius for employing what I would characterize as American civil religion, themes from American civil religion to evoke a response in the wider nation. The thing that I think it's so my response to Clay is really it's on two different levels. It's the churches, but it's also the legitimacy or illegitimacy in some minds of using religious symbols in public discourse. Judy Herseth.
Sorry.
I'm going back, Bruce, to your comment about your, I'm not going to phrase this correctly, your ambivalence about Black churches because of the power that they have had in the lives of those people. And as a product of a women's college, I was thinking, there's a parallel there. Because I'm a product of a women's college, I have a confidence and a belief in my own worth that I would not have had if I had not gone to a women's college. It's a choice, but I feel the idea that you articulated to me was there is a very positive place for Black churches as a choice in the religious landscape.
Well, I would add, just parallel to that, there has been a resurgence of interest in Black colleges and universities by Black students. There, not long ago, I don't know if you follow this, not long ago, there was a question, will the historically Black institution survive? Rarely is that a question now, because there has been this, for precisely the reason you articulate, a renewal of interest in that sort of experience.
So Jeff Jordan's hand, I think on the second screen.
Thanks, Kathy. I just wanted to come back to this conversation of culture in our churches and the word comfort, what we're comfortable with, which is an interesting concept. And one of the things in a lot of work that we're doing right now on diversity, equity, and inclusion partly has to deal with dominant and majorities finding their ability to be uncomfortable, finding discomfort, because if everything goes to the majority's comfort level, then it's hard to see change. And taking it out of a race context, or maybe it isn't a race context, I remember I spent 2 years in Korea as a volunteer in mission for the Presbyterian Church in a fascinating and growing Presbyterian movement. I mean, the Presbyterian Church in Korea has got an amazing history. There were all types of things as a teacher and a young missionary in Korea that were way outside of my comfort zone that weren't my Presbyterianism. Laying on of hands, all night prayer services, wailing in prayer, all types of things that for me were way outside of my comfort zone and way outside of my level of understanding. That's not how Presbyterians did it. I grew up in Mecklenburg County, one of the biggest, we had our own synod. There were so many Presbyterians in that one county in North Carolina. But I came after my time there to a very different comfort level. It changed forever what I felt like. And I work a lot in Africa and I spend a lot of times in the health sector, but usually when I'm there, I'm involved in some kind of religious gatherings or other kinds of things. And my comfort zone is very, very different now from what it was. So part of, I think, what we as white Presbyterians have to deal with is being willing to be uncomfortable, to being willing to sit in your discomfort a little bit, to open up to things that we've just closed ourselves to. And that's, I think, one of the things. And I agree, Bruce, with you and these other things about separateness and the importance of having our distinctness in this. But if we're going to be allies, we also have to find those spaces to be and to understand our discomfort if we're truly going to open this up.
That's a very helpful comment. Let me just say, I have read some testimony from people involved in efforts by churches to be more inclusive, as they say, and to change their ethos in such a way as to be that. And oftentimes, Jeff, that's exactly the sort of thing that people have reported. That I didn't think such and such was possible in a Presbyterian church, but the more I've thought about it, the more I think it makes sense. And I'm glad that I was exposed to this thing that made me kind of uneasy, I think was the word, when I first encountered it. Kathy, are we supposed to go to church?
I think we should go to church soon. Bruce, we appreciated this tremendously. We thank you very, very much. It clearly has started a conversation that will continue. And so thank you very, very much from all of us. And
thank all the rest of you.
Look
Thank you,
forward to the
Bruce.
rest of the conversation. Thanks to
Thank you,
everybody.
Bruce. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce.